Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're listening to us from. It is such a pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation. My name is Yawa Hansen Kwao, and I'm the Executive Director of Emerging Public Leaders. Emerging Public Leaders is a public service leadership organization, and our vision is really to inspire and to equip a new generation of ethical and competent public service leaders for Africa. For nearly a decade, Emerging Public Leaders has been providing training, mentoring, and other opportunities that have really kickstarted the public service careers of hundreds of young public servants in Africa. And by supporting young people to participate in governance, we're doing our part to contribute to an Africa that is peaceful, prosperous, and just. So through our In Conversation series, which is what we're hosting right now, we are also facilitating conversations that matter. We're connecting Africa's young people to each other and spurring the types of conversations that help to inform, to inspire, and to transform. So today's conversation is such a timely one. On the heels of a deeply contentious US election, a new president of the United States has finally been inaugurated. And as President Biden pulls together a cabinet and formulates his policies, the world is watching. And today's guest will help us to contemplate just how the political changes in the US will likely affect Africa. So it's our honor today to have with us Judd Devermont. He is the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He is a lecturer at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he also teaches a class on US intelligence analysis on sub-Saharan Africa. Judd is also a senior advisor at Kapunda Capital, a Pan-African investment platform. And before his work at CSIS, Judd served as National Intelligence Officer for Africa at the CIA in the US. So we are really excited and honored and privileged to have you join us today, Judd. So Judd, on the call today, we've got hundreds of young people across Africa, as well as some honored and invited guests. Can you please say hello and give us a brief introduction?
Yeah, thank you, Yawa, and thanks to Emerging Public Leaders for inviting me. It's truly an honor to talk to young leaders across the continent. As you've said, I spent the better part of 20 years working on African issues and living on the continent in South Africa and in Nigeria. And most of the time until the last 2.5 years, I worked in government, in intelligence, but also in foreign policy and as a diplomat. So I'm excited to share some of my experiences, but I'm really thrilled to hear your thoughts, yours, Yawa, and the audience's, because this is all about a dialogue.
Absolutely, and we're excited to kickstart some dialogue right now. I want to start off first with, what's been on top of everyone's mind for the last several weeks. What is happening in the United States? The past few weeks have been monumental in different ways. There's been a contentious US election, the results of which a large part of the US population doesn't quite accept. There was some violence, unprecedented, that we hadn't seen in recent times on the US Capitol. There are opinions brewing all over the world about whether or not this is a signal that the US is losing its significance or its moral authority to recommend democracy. I wonder what your comments are from where you sit.
Yeah, this has been a very humbling experience, watching what has been happening, not only during the insurrection on June 6th, but the challenges to the election results and really the last 4 years, the way in which there have been attacks on media, how institutions have been undermined, how there's been attempts to politicize the public service. And I keep thinking about Amanda Gorman, who was the poet laureate's comment about the US, that democracy has not been defeated in America. And our challenges just say how unfinished we are as a country. And what I think this moment does for us, the United States, is perhaps it allows us to engage with our partners in a new way. in a way that isn't tisk tisk, wagging our fingers, isn't talking about how we are grand and everyone should emulate us, but rather starting at a point of, well, we're all trying to do this. We're all trying to perfect our democracies. We're all struggling with division, with identity politics. We have leaders at times that bend authoritarian to the authoritarian side. And then how do we create firewalls against that? And I think as we look to this next couple of weeks and months, big questions are going to be around President Biden's ability to revive bipartisanship. I think that is a tall task. I'm pleased that some of the nominations that have already been confirmed have done with largely a big majority of Democrats and Republicans. I'm going to be looking towards where the press goes and media goes and social media, where so much of that division is sowed. And then progressive reforms that create a more inclusive government. So on one hand, we're talking about having a government that looks more like America. On the other hand, is reaching out to many of the Trump supporters who oppose President Biden and who feel left out of the system as well. So I think those are really going to be the key markers of how we get better, how we build back better, to use President Biden's phrase.
Well, Judd, I know for a lot of Africans who've been watching what's been happening in the US, and as I've tuned into local news, I'm speaking to you from Accra, Ghana, which is where I'm from. As I've tuned into local news, there's been an interesting trend of narrative, which has said this is proof that um, the day of that one nation, that superpower nation that kind of dictates what's happening across the world is done. I don't know if you share that sentiment, because I think what's behind that narrative is also a wondering about what President Biden's posture towards Africa may be. I'm sure you are well aware that there are millions of Africans living in the United States. There are millions of families here on the continent that depend on resources that come from those family members overseas. And so, as you think of this narrative and as you think about the impact of a Biden presidency on Africa, what is top of mind for you?
The first thing that President Biden has to do, and by the way, this is both specific to Africa, but really we could be having the same conversation about South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America. He's got to reset the relationships. He's got to restore, repair, revive. I mean, they've just been under a tremendous amount of damage over the past 4 years. And when we talk about Africa specifically, the way I would characterize it is that it has been neglectful, mean-spirited, China obsessed, and we have to get back to a place where we can have partnerships with African governments, African leaders, civil society, African youth, and that I think is about sort of regrounding in our values, which has been, I think, missing in a lot of our policy, and bringing back and elevating competent diplomats and leaders. And today happens to be the start of the hearings for Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield to be our next UN ambassador, US ambassador to the UN. And if you don't know Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, she used to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. She was an ambassador to Liberia. She really knows the continent. She really knows the foreign service, diplomacy. So I think that's incredibly important. It's a good sign of where we're going. But there's a couple other things that I think we should put out for the conversation, which is this government, and even when it was still just a campaign, the Biden team had been talking about democracy and government issues at the highest level. So commenting on the Lekki massacre in Nigeria, talking about why End SARS is an important movement. There's been a number of comments and statements recently about Ethiopia and the conflict there, and about the illegitimate election in Uganda and the way in which security forces surrounded Bobby Wine's home. It's not that we didn't have those in the Trump administration, but those are only happening because there were really good diplomats at our embassies, not because Secretary Pompeo or President Trump, really were pushing the issue. So those are positive. You saw on day one, they reversed the travel ban. So if you're a Nigerian, an Eritrean, a Somali, a Sudanese, or a Tanzanian, that travel ban is gone. He rejoined the WHO. Important because that means that he's going to contribute to COVAX, the vaccine, and then the Paris climate agreements, which is about climate change. So those are all really good, but I just want to leave one extra point, Yawa, is that I don't think we should think about this as a Obama 2.0. I think we're going to restore some of the best stuff that happened under Obama and President Bush and President Clinton. I think all of our administrations have had a really strong record in Africa, but this president, President Biden, wants to do more. And two things are important. One, way more engagement with the African diaspora than I think in the other administrations. Not that that wasn't important, but he's clearly wanting to elevate that. We can see that just by the number of Nigerian Americans that are in very high level positions. The second one, I'm maybe most excited about this, is an urbanization initiative. Too often, our policymakers have thought of Africa as rural and agricultural, and we know that it's already 40% urban, will be 50% urban by the end of this decade. So President Biden is looking to think about how does he engage with municipal leaders, with civil societies, with urban, dwellers, with urban traders, and create, cities for the 21st century.
Well, Judd, I'm happy to hear and to note how President Biden seems to be interested in drawing these linkages between Africa, the continent, and Africans living within the US. Ghana, for example, hosted a very big, undertaking to get Africans to come back for the year of return last year, which marked the 400th anniversary of the first slaves leaving to the shores of the US. So I see significant movements, at least from certain African governments. And I do also note that the global uproar that surrounded the George Floyd murder last summer also ignited the sense of, what happens to Africans or people of African descent living abroad is of great concern here. So I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners right now would be excited to see more action to forge some closer linkages. I did want to ask you, Judd, about transitions and political transitions on the continent. This past year, there were several elections, in my country included. And, I do know that it is part of the work of the center, the Africa team at the CSIS to kind of keep a close watch. What are the trends that you're seeing? What, if anything, is worrisome to you? And what do you think this administration is going to keep close eyes on?
That's a great question. So let me set the table just a little bit, Yawa. I think Africa is entering a new period of political volatility, right? There's been the forces that have been disruptive to the equilibrium, which has largely been the autocratic governments have had an ability to overpower sometimes the opposition or civil society. But because of urbanization, because of a growing middle class, because of mobile phones particularly, I think we've seen some of the rules of the road be ripped up, and they're being built right now. And what that means is that not that there's going to be more democracies or more autocracies in the near future. It means that we are going to see some we're going to see some swings, some very dramatic swings, right? What happened in Gambia, for example, right? That Jammeh could be defeated at the ballot box. But then the tragedy of what's happening, for example, in Tanzania, right? So countries that have been democratic stalwarts falling backwards, countries that have been long-standing autocrats like the Gambia or Sudan or Burkina Faso having democratic change. Since 2015, this is really interesting. There has been 33 peaceful transfers of power across the continent. In February next month, Niger will have its first transition, so we'll be at 34. And a lot of those are incumbents handing over to a member of their party. But actually 18, so almost half, more than half, are actually opposition wins. So that's an interesting place to be right now. And here are maybe the 6 or so things that I would recommend us looking at. One, protest movements. We're seeing Africans take the streets demanding political and economic reform. In fact, Africa has seen the largest increases of anti-government protests in the world, more than twice the global average. So think about NSARS, think about Sudan, think about Burkina Faso. We're seeing more fiddling with the Constitution. particularly around third term. So in West Africa, we just saw this in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire. I'm very concerned about Zambia. President Lungu is making an argument that he gets a third term. What's not talked a lot about in media right now is candidate disqualifications are increasingly part of the autocrat or the incumbent playbook. So even in democracies, Macky Sall disqualified 2 of his opponents. We saw this in Cote d'Ivoire with Gbagbo and Soro. That happened in Niger. This is probably going to happen in Benin. So that's another one to look at. Number 4 is around COVID-19. The manipulation of COVID-19 and the pandemic sort of bans on public gathering, decisions to delay an election because it is not in an incumbent's favor, or to fast track it because it would be in their favor. The use of food and COVID assistance to help the ruling party's supporters. We saw this in Togo and Uganda. That is going to, because the pandemic will continue to go, and then we'll have the issue of vaccines, something very important to watch. And then 5, internet shutdowns. We don't have the numbers for 2020, but in 2019, there was 25 documented incidences of partial or total internet shutdowns. This has obviously happened in Uganda just recently. This is going to continue to happen, and it's very troublesome. And so to wrap up to the top of your question, Yawa, about what should the Biden administration do, the 6th point is, what will the foreign government's response be to this? You know, we have seen the US be largely absent outside of really good ambassadors, but not at the national level on these issues. UK has been involved in its Brexit. You know, we have the role of China and Russia, who may not be or aren't proponents of democracy. They want people to emulate their systems. And so President Biden is going to have to lead a global conversation about democracy in my country, in the United States, and also in Africa. What we should all be looking for is the upcoming Summit for Democracy. How many Africans will be there? What will be their role? What are the messages that will be delivered? Is it a standalone event, or is it the beginning of an important conversation?
Those are really helpful and useful insights, Judd. And as we talk about political transitions, I think another reflection point as an outsider looking to the US that has been topical, at least in our media landscape, has been looking at how a political transition in the US several years ago resulted in kind of a diminishing of public service. I wonder if you can talk to that specifically, because our organization, Emerging Public Leaders, is all about that. We say civil service is the secret sauce, that if you want to deliver public good and ensure that citizens have access to essential services, you have to have a solid civil service, or public institutions are built on the backs of, competent and ethical public servants. So I wonder, what you've seen just kind of on the US side over the years, and what are your hopes for the rebuilding of, public service institutions under the President Biden's administration?
Yeah, I was in Nigeria when President Obama was elected, and I remember getting emails from friends and family who were so excited about that election and wanting to do their part and join government. So there was a big bump of people who signed up for the Foreign Service or the civil service or local government because of what President Obama signified and the excitement. And then that obviously dissipated under President Trump. I left government in 2018. It didn't have to do with politics. It had to do with my own career trajectory and what made sense for me. But I've had subsequent conversations with lots of my friends who remain in government. And, we talk about the challenges of this administration, particularly or that administration, I should say, the way in which they talked about a deep state. And every one of them said, my job and my oath is to the Constitution and to the American people. And that is what I am doing every day, is to fulfill my oath and to do the job that I was hired to do. And, I think that they are a huge part why the policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, for example, while I said it was neglectful and mean-spirited, that was tonal in some respects, right? The good work that was happening at embassies, that continued because of civil servants. So now we have this new opportunity, right? So we have a new opportunity because we have a president who is serious about a government respects professionals. And we're seeing just a flood of people rejoin the government who left in the last 4 years, and very senior people and very junior people. And I think that we will see not just returnees, but we will see an uptick in people signing up because they're inspired, because they recognize that our country is in not great shape, and it requires an all hands on deck moment.
All hands on deck for sure. As we talk about political transitions and the impact that it has on who's attracted to or wanting to participate in, or offer their services to government, I also, one of the topical discussions that we've had as an organization with our fellows has been around, the kind of civil servant that's needed for a time like this, as the world is grappling with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and grappling with the resultant economic declines. Do you think that this is necessarily changing the kind of person or the archetype of who a stellar civil servant is? I'm curious what your reflection on that might be.
Yeah, it's a great question. Most people who are succeeding in this environment have to be self-starters, right? They have to be able to focus because, Zimbabwe, for example, 90% of the workforce is now at home. In my government, in the U.S. government, as much as possible, people are working from home. So that means that you have the distraction of your dog, and hopefully he won't bark during our conversation, or you're taking care of your family, or you've got deliveries. I mean, there's a lot of distraction. So you have to be able to focus. You have to be proactive. You're not sitting next to your boss. You're working diligently on your own or in teams or on virtual. And so there's a different sort of person, I think, that is going to succeed in there. And maybe this is counterintuitive, but you have to figure out how to put limits on yourself. So you can do good work, focused work, but that you don't, run on fumes at the end of the day, right? There is no separation between work and play sometimes, and that's really important, getting that balance right. So I think that those are the big sort of focuses, and then everything else is constant, right? It's mission, commitment, patriotism. I think being able, and maybe even more important now, is a strong writing and oral communication skills, because all we're doing is Zoom all the time. You don't have necessarily the ability to communicate in the sort of the micro ways that we do. So that's incredibly important. And then I think networking is still important. People who are good at building relationships are going to be very successful in this environment, because you have to do it. I'm on Slack and Zoom and Teams and email and text and WhatsApp. I mean, nonstop now. And so you've got to have, not only good technological hygiene, but you've got to be able to build relationships in a virtual setting.
Awesome. And I think the other dimension of staff, or the qualities that you need in a civil servant today, I think was really amplified a few weeks ago as we watched or listened to the news that your previous president had called some lawmakers in one of your states to compel them or to pressure them to do something that at least seems unethical to do. And I think that as we think about the skills around the hard skills, the technical skills, we can't overlook the ethics and the character that's needed for public service. Wouldn't you say?
No, absolutely. I mean, for all of the tumult of the last couple of weeks following the election, Americans should be very proud of a couple of things. Folks like the governor of Georgia and the secretary of state who, pushed back when President Trump tried to pressure them to invalidate the elections. The courts, right? The courts that heard these spurious objections and rejected them. The fact that the vice president, former vice president Mike Pence, upheld his responsibilities, did not invalidate or challenge the election, proceeded or oversaw the confirmation, the fact that most senators voted for validating the election. So civil servants, the courts, uh, they did what was ethically right, morally right, and what they were bound by their oath to office.
Yes, and that's exactly what we teach, and it's what's integrated into our training for our fellows at Emerging Public Leaders. So thank you for commenting on that as well, the importance of, ethics and character. We do have a question from one of our audience members, and I want to read it to you real quick. What are the innovations, Judd, that you see in Africa, especially in the area of governance and public service, that the Biden administration could consider to deliver on its promise of building back better?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. There are a number of countries that are figuring out how to ingest Africans, smart entrepreneurial Africans into government service, at different levels, not just entry level. And I think that's one of the things that the Biden administration is thinking through right now, that something beyond just political appointments at the top of the organization, but how do you put people in a mid-career spot because they have technical skills, expertise, but maybe aren't sort of appropriate for being at the junior rung. I think that's been really interesting. I think African governments do a very good job of creating commissions, creating ad hoc organizations where young people can weigh in on different issues. I would say that some of the leaders, particularly President Ramaphosa, has been a phenomenal communicator during this crisis. And I think that that's really important. One of the things that I have thought through a lot over the last 4 years is how important it is to be authentic when talking to people. And sometimes US diplomats or officials, just read talking points, which is important. You have a message you have to deliver. But I think there's a number of leaders who are incredibly good at connecting to their publics because they are authentically who they are. And maybe they do that best on the pitch, going to a soccer game. Maybe they do that best doing Jerusalem dancing. Maybe they do that best just by the way they communicate on social media or at the podium. But finding a way to show who you are as a person, as well as a professional, is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I'd love to draw your attention towards COVID and information. And I think, here in Ghana, our president every 2 weeks or so gives a presidential address giving updates on COVID situation. And to your point about just connection and authenticity, I see that that's played really well, at least here in Ghana. And I too have been following, South Africa, and I can concur with your points there. But I think that one observation we're making is that people are getting fatigued and beginning to mistrust
Yeah.
information that they're receiving through public channels and official channels. And I want to link it to what you were saying earlier about information, disinformation, and how, this is an unprecedented moment in many cases. There's been, lots of conspiracy theories about the virus itself, whether or not, I remember at the beginning, for example, there were stories here in Ghana that no, we didn't have to worry about it. It doesn't affect Black people. And, and watched in horror weeks later as we looked at the stats, at least coming out of the US, and saw that, communities of Black and Brown people were disproportionately affected. So I wonder, as you, I'm sure, no doubt, studying this and watching this, at least on the continent, what are the trends that you're seeing, and where do you think some of the solutions lie in dealing with the disinformation trend that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think this is where a public-private partnership is so important. So we talked about Ramaphosa and President Akufo-Addo, and I would add Finance Minister Afori Atta. not only talking frequently to their publics, Macky Sall of Senegal, but delivering bad news when you need to hear it, right? Like that's really important. We can't whitewash, we can't paper over that the dark days are ahead of us. And I think that we probably need to see more from leaders when they do have COVID infections to be transparent about that, to model good behavior around quarantines. The president of Botswana, President Masisi, I think he's gone to quarantine like 4 times, maybe 5. But then there are ministers, for example, in the South African government who just got in trouble because they weren't wearing masks at a funeral. Or there's been Nollywood stars who have had parties at their house. So it's a responsibility for everyone to model good behavior. In fact, I get in trouble with my wife because I go out. I've gone out once or twice to walk my dog and I didn't have my mask. And she's a nurse, so I get in big trouble. So it doesn't matter what I'm doing. If I'm outside of my house, I'm wearing a mask. So I think that's 1. 2, we have to create networks of trust. And one of the organizations that I like a lot is Africa Check. So Africa Check, works in Nigeria and Kenya and South Africa primarily, but I think they do have some regional presence, and they're often debunking these myths. And they're doing it they have something called What's Crap on WhatsApp. And then they're trying to do that as well, right? Like what is not, and finding those validators or finding those, I think, reliable sources, and that's where the private sector really comes in together, so people can say, well, I heard that, sunlight, or I heard that a particular soup or herbal remedy, that doesn't work, that works, excuse me. And then going to be able to go to these sources is really important, and then share that, because sharing the right information to a friend or family member is going to be more important than what you read, on what you hear on Joy FM or the Liberian Observer, right? Like those are really important to be able to communicate facts. One last point about leadership that I failed to mention is that not only is President Ramaphosa talking about it a lot, but what I really like, and I think we'll see this a lot with President Biden, is he's putting Minister McKeezy or the head of their health department, Salim, or Slim, he's known as, in front of the camera. So letting science lead is really important from a government standpoint.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Let science lead, especially when you're in the midst of a global pandemic. I have another question from an audience member. I'd love to read it to you as well. They're asking about a comparison between the US civil service and the African civil service. And the question is, how attractive is the US civil service that motivates young people there to take that up as a career path? And how does that compare to what you see in Africa?
Okay, well, yeah, you may have to help me with this a little bit because I don't want to be trafficking in stereotypes. And I think one of the things social scientists have talked a lot about is that there hasn't been enough research on the African civil service, although there's a growing trend to sort of refocus on it as a matter of study. And I also think there's been a growth in the sort of World Bank programming and others on the civil service. But I think here's one of the fundamental challenges. And not every country has this problem or challenge, but there are some. So in the American civil service, ultimately it's a meritocracy. Getting in, you take an exam, it's objective. We try to make sure that it represents, all of America, but other than that, it's a meritocracy, and you can rise very far in that process, and you can make a difference. Right? Those are probably the 3 things. It's, there's no funny business in terms of getting in. You can get as far as your capacity and talent allow you, and you can do good. I think for some African civil servants, there's a lot of questions about how you get in, who you need to know. There are a second layer of challenges in being able actually to rise, right? That your, informal network you may not be moving up because of merit, but because of who you know. Sometimes the pay is inconsistent or too low in the African bureaucracies, and so there's a temptation to be involved in corruption. And then the last part is, can you make a difference? there are some governments, we won't name names, but if you need a decision, you have to go to the president,
Mm.
right? Like in the American civil service, you can get decisions out of a junior officer if it's appropriate for that junior officer, a middle officer if that's appropriate, a more senior one, but it doesn't have to go up to the perm sec or the minister or the president. And I think the bureaucracies that you can get a decision out at a very low level tell you a lot about the delegation of responsibility and the empowerment of civil servants. And that's very attractive for anyone, right? No one wants to be in a job where you're just, twiddling your thumbs, pushing paper. You want to be part of a process that makes your country better. Is that right?
Absolutely.
I don't know. I don't know if that's too broad of a brush, Yawa.
Well, I think you've really amplified some of the struggles for a lot of African civil service institutions, where the entry barriers are usually filled with gatekeepers, and it's not necessarily always a merit-based process, which is why the work that we're doing with emerging public leaders we feel is so significant. And building upon the work we started over a decade ago in Liberia, and to see that it was having that trusted network of young talented professionals that really helped establish these public sector institutions, and really supported the great work that President Sirleaf championed at the time. How do you build trust in large bureaucracies? Because I think that that's part of how you attract great talent, by some of the things that you've just described, but it's also these networks, don't you think? But are there other things that help contribute to citizens trust, but also the internal trust that gets built in public and large bureaucracies?
Yeah, it's difficult, and I think some of it's done in a retail manner, right, person to person, but some of it is done by depending on your bureaucratic function. So, because I come from the foreign policy world, let me just talk about foreign policy because this is really a hot topic right now in the U.S. I worked mainly in intelligence, so I'm not talking to my family and friends about what I do. I was a special case. But when you look at the broader foreign policy apparatus, too often, US diplomats weren't talking to Americans about what they were doing. They were talking to Africans or Southeast Asians or whomever whoever is in their sort of responsibility in their portfolio. And this was made clear, I think, during in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, is that it's incumbent on bureaucrats to talk about the challenges in America, both to American audiences and to their foreign counterparts. So we're doing this series actually, Yawa, called Why Africa Matters to US Cities. And the reason why we started this is because every day I'm asked, you haven't asked me, that's great. Why does Africa matter to America? And if it's for someone here in Washington, D.C., it's a very sort of set, answers about, the economy or national security interests like counterterrorism. I have, I think, a more nuanced one, but that's sort of the standard for the last, decade and a half. That doesn't work in America. I mean, that doesn't work outside of Washington, D.C. That doesn't work in Wichita, Kansas. That doesn't work in Boise, Idaho. That doesn't work in Silicon Valley. So we decided that we would look at why and how relations with Africa enrich cities. And we looked at 15 cities from Birmingham, Alabama, to some of the ones I just mentioned. And we actually were fairly random about those cities. Can we make an argument? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can we make an argument that what African foreign policy enriches creates jobs, for example, which is something that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's really big on? Does national foreign policy create jobs for Americans? How does the African diaspora enrich our cultural communities? How do immigrants, contribute to society? What are the ways in which Africans increase academic excellence? What are the ways in which Africans, become our pastors and our doctors? What are the ways in which, that we see U.S. politicians of either African descent or not become immersed in African politics. And so we've decided to start creating a hometown argument instead of just a beltway argument, which means just here in Washington, D.C. And this may seem like I'm getting off topic, but my point is you have to figure out how to communicate what you're doing to your family, friends, the general public, and you can't speak in the same bureaucratic language or government sort of ways that we do between each other. We have to start from where your counterpart is, what matters in his or her life, and then try to communicate what you're doing and what you do improves their lives, because that's what government is for, right? It's of and for the people.
That definitely resonates with me, this idea of kind of simplifying the message and making, your audience, building trust with your audiences, both internally and externally. I do have a few more audience questions I'd love to throw at you, Judd.
Go for it.
A question is around the suspicion that sometimes Africans look at the US with. So it's generally believed that the activities of Western countries in any developing economy have ulterior motives beyond addressing the immediate needs of people. So, interestingly, what this audience member has seen and heard of President Biden gives them an impression that he genuinely has respect and regard for Africans. So, under President Biden's watch, what should we expect as the key interests that the US will have in Africa?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know that this can be a constant sort of stereotype that American government, has ulterior motives. Um, let's just be honest. There are a set of things that the American people and the American government have in terms of interest when it comes to their relationships with Africa. There are a set of things that which African publics and governments want in their relationship with the U.S. or for their people. And I think most of the time, there's a pretty good overlap, right? It's in the US government and the US people's interest that Africans prosper, right? So that there's an ability to do trade and investment. And so we can all, take care of our family and friends. There's an interest in conflict receding, right? Because that's a key ingredient for that peace and prosperity. There's an interest in democracy flourishing because, we believe that African democracies are going to be more likely to agree on issues with the US in international forum, right? So there are going to be a bucket of things that maybe are important to the US and less important to African governments or publics, but we could say that that's a truism, right? That's a universality to foreign policy. So President Biden, I think you're absolutely right. I know that if you're South African, you've probably seen a replay of this speech he gave in the 1980s when he was in the Senate, where he was really taking the Reagan administration to task for their support of apartheid South Africa. It was an incredibly passionate speech and interrogation really of State Department officials about why we weren't supporting the ANC at that time. So from that kernel, I think that you can see that he is one of the most people focused politicians that we have. I mean, I've seen him when I was in government interact with African leaders, and it's incredible the way that he connects, he empathizes, he is able to put himself in the shoes of Africans or whomever he's talking to. Really, doesn't matter if you're from Accra or you're from Alabama. That's just, I think, innately who President Biden is. What you should expect to see from President Biden, in addition to some of the things I mentioned around urbanization or a growing sort of engagement with the diaspora, when it comes to Africa, you are going to see him take African voices much more seriously in multilateral organizations. Again, I think Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield is a signal that Africans have important global voices. I think you will see him engage, or his government engage more with civil society. The statement around End SARS, I think, was a signal of that. And the last thing is what the president is going to do on the pandemic. We have a very serious situation here in the United States, but by rejoining the WHO, which rejoining COVAX, I think this president understands that unless everyone is vaccinated, we all aren't safe. So I think those will be some of the cornerstones of the Biden campaign, the Biden presidency, and I think those are perfectly agreeable, probably from an African perspective.
Right. And Judd, I note that just hours ago, it may have been, yesterday, I think, that President Biden announced an ambitious plan for hundreds of millions of doses of the COVID vaccines for American citizens. And we're kind of sitting here in Africa looking to our leaders as well and wondering when there will be some widespread availability here. And I wonder what you foresee as the posture of the Biden administration towards supporting African countries to access COVID vaccines.
Yeah. So one of them is COVAX, right, which is a multilateral vaccine that is distributed by the WHO, and so that's clearly going to be one of the ways in which President Biden is going to work with African leaders to make sure that they get sufficient number of doses. There's something else that we haven't talked about, which is really germane to this conversation. We did a study at CSIS looking at multilateral, or sort of, what we would call not vaccine, we would call it a sort of, medical pandemic diplomacy, right? 24 different countries we've counted are doing different sorts of things in African countries, right? China is doing PPEs, the UAE, Turkey, the European Union, the US is giving a lot of money, India is giving some pills, right? So we've got 24 countries doing everything siloed on their own. And what I'd like, and I think that that's opened up some opportunities for corruption, quite frankly, in Zambia and Zimbabwe and Nigeria and some of the cases that we've heard. And sometimes it resulted in not great quality of supplies. So Minister Kagwe of Kenya has talked about how the Chinese PPEs are not of sufficient quality. And what I hope to see President Biden do, and I don't know this, but given where he stands on the pandemic and multilateralism, is create a better coalition working with different countries to make sure that Africa gets a vaccine. So maybe they won't be US purchased vaccine, but India has already started to deliver vaccines, for example, to Mauritius and Seychelles. I think we're going to have a lot of issues with Sputnik 5, the Russian vaccine, and I think we're going to want to do some due diligence on Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine. But I think there's a set of countries that would be quite comfortable working with them to make sure that Africans get vaccines.
Awesome. And there's another audience question that says democracy is indeed by the people and for the people. However, I see Africa's policies more political than stakeholder engagements. What's your take?
Well, we've got 49 countries, right, in sub-Saharan Africa, 54 across the continent. And so I guess we have to be specific, but I think it really depends on what country we're talking about when we're talking about are people looking out, are leaders looking out for their constituents, or are they looking out for themselves? I am an admirer of countries like Ghana, like South Africa, where there is really a vigorous debate and free press, where where leaders lose at the ballot box because they have not delivered. Right, in Ghana now you have the opposition in control of the parliament, and you have the MPP at the presidency. That actually may be the case in the Liberian Senate as well. So a divided government, but I think that has a lot to do with where people have the power to hold their leaders to account. And that usually makes a difference. If you aren't able to hold your leader to account, if you aren't able to exercise your vote and it's counted, well then yeah, politics is not going to be about the people. If it is the people who can investigate a bad, corrupt deal, it's the people who can, in the case of Kenya, reject a Chinese coal plant in Lamu and say this is not environmentally sound, and the courts uphold it. That is the best antidote to elite politics, to authoritarianism, to autocracy. And there's a lot of countries where we can point to those experiences. Even in Uganda, which, what President Museveni has done to Bobby Wine and to other candidates and the shutting down of the media, the fact that the courts overruled the security around, the security posture around his house, or the fact that the NRM, the ruling party, did lose some seats at the most significant members of parliament, tells you that there are opportunities here. Although I would not classify Uganda as a democracy, but those are the ingredients that one needs.
Great. And I think the audience member has clarified that their question was Ghana specific, but I do think you touched on Ghana a little bit, but I don't know if there are any things that you see worrisome in Ghana's politics at the moment.
Well, one of the perennial challenges that I've seen in Ghanaian politics is vigilantism, and the way in which both of the parties have indulged at different points on that. But I would be disingenuous if I talked about Ghanaian politics as if my system is working perfectly well. Where if I didn't have vigilantism in my own country, yeah, I remember you and I were chatting earlier this month, right? And there was the brawl in the parliament, and I said to you, "What's happening in your parliament?" And you said to me, "What's happening at the Capitol?" Right? So I do think that Ghana has some things in its democracy that it has to work at. I think there's some consistent issues around illicit fishing, around Galamsey, that need to be worked on. But at the end of the day, former President John Mahama is going to the courts, and President Akufo-Addo welcomed that. And that's a peaceful way to resolve political conflict. And I think that's a testament to Ghana's political evolution and some things that we can learn from.
Awesome. And as we wind up this conversation, Judd, I want to go back to your time as a public servant and working for government. And as I said, we've got fellows from Liberia, from Ghana, and some of our partners on this call. And part of what we aspire to do through this In Conversation series is to really inspire hope in public service in general. I do believe that every country needs its best and brightest in government, and that's what we're working to enable through emerging public leaders. As you recount your public service career, what are the things that kept you hopeful? Because I do recognize that whether you're in a public institution in Ghana or elsewhere, it's not the same as working for like a private entity. And I'm sure you had colleagues working in private institutions that perhaps made more money than you, had more opportunity. What is the thing that you would say to young civil service professionals right now about why their work matters?
Yeah, let me just quickly tell a little about my own experience. So I said that I worked in intelligence. That didn't mean I was like a spy like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. I was an analyst. I did the very unsexy work of writing reports. That's all I did. I just wrote reports. And every day I loved coming to my job every day, because my job was to tell my leaders good and bad news. I could tell them, based on my own judgment, this is happening and this is a problem, or this is happening and you should take note of it because it's an important development that means that has a positive effect for U.S. interests. And I was in a job, this is what analysts do, is to, as we say, talk truth to power. I delivered some very bad news to US government officials that their policies weren't working, perhaps, or that something that they expected wasn't going to go the way that they thought. And that made a difference, right? Because my government had to listen to me. They may have argued, but ultimately I had a role where they had to listen and then make better policy. Or if they were good leaders, they would make better policy. And that was incredibly rewarding. It was, 20, I was there for 16 years, and it was, working with smart people, committed people, mission-driven people to do their part in to make sure that our policies, our relationships worked and that were most productive and constructive for the American people and our partners was incredibly powerful. And so, you know, I would first make sure that you're starting with that sense of mission, right? That why you're doing this, because it's not a glamorous job, right? The money isn't great, but you're doing stuff that is going to change, hopefully change the trajectory of your country. And you know, I said it a little bit earlier, but maybe it's worthwhile to just reiterate this, Yawa, is that you should read widely. I read a lot about Africa, but I always make sure to take up a book on India or China or the US history to just kind of make sure that I'm reading widely, to deepen your expertise, to develop these writing and oral communication skills. It's incredibly important. Work really hard, build a network, and here's the important twist. It does not mean just finding patrons. It means peers, and it means mentees. You should have a mentee on day one. You should have people that you're bringing up too. That's so important. And then finally, be open to possibility. You know, be ready to pivot. Be ready to take a new opportunity. You know, you may not get the job that you want. Take the other job. Perform well. For me, those are the ingredients to be successful and have a rewarding career and to do good for your country.
Those are awesome tidbits. And I really like your point about as you're building your network, you should not just be identifying patrons, but you're never too young to mentor other people. And that is something that we strongly encourage all of our public service fellows to do, to leverage their leadership for the good of others and to reach back and to support. And we've seen examples of our fellows, you know, participating and volunteering their time in their communities over this COVID, you know, lockdown period. And we're really glad to hear you amplify that as well. So I recognize we're down to our last 2 minutes, but I would welcome you to give any final thoughts that you have as you think overall about the US relationship with Africa under Biden's administration.
Yeah, obviously I'm bullish about it. I mean, in part because it's from a low base, right? I mean, I think we're going to be in a better position than we were in the last 4 years. But here's a couple of things that we should keep in our mind. This is going to be a relationship that is fact-based. You're not going to see the president talk about, you know, land appropriation in South Africa with no evidence. A good friend of mine had just made this point. This is going to be a relationship that is going to be mature, that there is going to be humility in terms of the way that we approach African governments and African civil society. We're going to talk about our own weaknesses, our own racial and ethnic divisions, our challenges as a democracy. But it's going to be at sometimes uncomfortable, maybe even tough going, because I think both of us deserve to tell each other hard truths about the state of our democracies, about human rights abuses, about, you know, discrimination. You know, it's one thing to say that to Zimbabwe. It's another thing to say that to Botswana or Senegal. And I think we have to do that. We should invite each other to do that. US policy sometimes has gotten to be so simple, where we've got good countries and bad countries. And I don't think we should see that anymore. We should be having these conversations. We should talk about important issues that we're working together with, but not be afraid to talk about things that we think are inconsistent with our shared values. So those are I think, my view on where we're going, in addition to everything else I've said about sort of programmatic, but I think those will be the cornerstones of our relationship.
Well, Judd, I thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an enlightening conversation as we've examined what the future may hold for the relationship between the US and Africa. To all of our audience members, thank you so much for your participation and engagement today and for all your great questions. Our guest today has been Mr. Judd Devermont, the director of the Center for of CSIS's Africa department, and we're so honored that he joined us today. Stay tuned for information about our upcoming conversations, and we look forward to seeing you then. So wherever you are in the world, have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.